The year is 1654. The air in colonial Virginia feels heavy, not only with the smell of curing tobacco, but with the unspoken weight of a question whispered in the fields, a dangerous thought that would permanently change the lives of 3 men, stripping them of freedom, and for one of them, condemning him to a legal darkness that would stretch across generations. This was no ordinary question. It challenged the very fabric of a new society, a direct clash with a truth too uncomfortable, too shameful to be openly faced. Why does the master's youngest son have my brother's eyes, his mouth, his hands? The man who dared to ask this impossible question was an African servant named John Punch. The man who heard it, the plantation overseer, would soon find his own life tightly bound to its dark implications. Within 48 hours of that fatal whisper, 1 man would be dead, his secret buried in the harsh Virginia soil, and another would be thrown into a legal void, becoming the first human being officially condemned to lifelong servitude in English America. What the colonial court buried in 1640 was not just a body, it was the cold blueprint for an institution that would consume millions, a silent judgment that would shape a nation for centuries. Before we go deeper into the troubling story of John Punch, and the question that, in its simple truth, changed American history forever, I ask you to do something. If you are listening from Virginia, Maryland, or anywhere in the United States, take a moment to leave a comment saying which state you are from. This is not just a story, it is a foundational piece of forgotten American history, a shadow from our shared past that deserves to be brought into the light. Subscribe now, because what you are about to hear has been carefully reconstructed from colonial court records hidden away for nearly 400 years. This is a truth you will not find in ordinary textbooks. Now allow me to take you back to a world long vanished, a world where the color of a person's skin had not yet been formally written into law as the final judge of destiny, but where one man's desperate search for truth would begin carving that line, sharp and unforgiving, into blood and law. Virginia, 1638. The colony was fragile and ambitious, barely 30 years removed from the desperate struggle of Jamestown's first settlers. It was a land of sharp contrasts, natural beauty standing beside brutal survival. Small tobacco plantations clung to the fertile banks of the James River and the Chesapeake Bay, each one an isolated outpost of English ambition in a vast and untamed wilderness. Jamestown, the young capital, was less a city and more a loose collection of rough wooden buildings, dirt roads that turned to thick mud with every rain, and a constant hum of labor driven by Europe's hunger for tobacco. Here, English settlers, African servants, and European indentured laborers worked side by side. Their sweat mixed into the soil under a legal system that, despite its strange complexities, made little distinction between them based on origin. Servitude, for most, was temporary. Contracts were signed, years were served, and freedom was eventually granted, often with a small piece of land and basic tools, no matter whether one came from London's crowded streets or the distant shores of West Africa. The Virginia summer air was thick and oppressive, clinging to skin and cloth like a heavy blanket. Mosquitoes rose in relentless clouds at dusk from marshes and stagnant waters, their high-pitched whine a constant torment. Tobacco plants, the colony's lifeblood, grew tall and broad, stretching toward the shining ribbon of the James River. Each autumn, merchant ships with towering masts and billowing sails arrived, eager to carry the precious harvest back to England's markets. The soil was rich but demanding, requiring endless labor, clearing, planting, weeding, harvesting, and then the careful curing of leaves. It was work that aged men too quickly, carving deep lines of fatigue into their faces. John Punch arrived in Virginia sometime around 1630, his journey a brutal test of human endurance. He was taken from the West African coast, a land of deep traditions and living cultures, aboard a ship whose name has been lost to history. The voyage lasted 3 months of darkness, foul air, the stench of crowded bodies, and the endless thunder of the ocean against the hull. He did not arrive as a slave. The word itself, with its meaning of permanent inherited bondage, held no legal power in English Virginia at that time. He was considered a servant bound by contract, even if he had never agreed to it, owned by a planter named Hugh Gwynn. Hugh Gwynn was in his early 40s, a second son from a minor Welsh gentry family. Like many others, he came to Virginia chasing wealth denied to him by England's rigid class system. He was practical, not openly cruel and not especially kind, driven by one consuming goal, to make his plantation profitable. In a colony where tobacco prices rose and fell wildly, Gwyn's ambition was both his strength and his defining trait. He lived with his wife Eleanor, a pale and quiet woman who rarely left the main house, and their 3 children. 2 daughters had been sent back to England for schooling, while a son named Thomas had recently returned from abroad. Punch worked the fields alongside 2 other servants. Though their backgrounds were vastly different, they shared the bond of indentured labor. One was James Gregory, a Scotsman with a clear scar across his left cheek, a reminder of a childhood accident. Gregory was talkative, filling their shared cabin with loud stories of the Scottish Highlands, clan feuds, and old loyalties that eventually drove him across the ocean. He had signed his contract in Glasgow to escape a blood feud that would have cost him his life. At 2008, with fiery red hair thinning at the crown and hands hardened by labor, Gregory had a quick temper and an even quicker laugh. He was the first to offer friendship to Punch when he arrived. The other servant was Victor, a Dutchman whose last name was never recorded. He was Gregory's opposite, quiet and guarded, speaking only when necessary. From Amsterdam, a city of trade and canals, Victor came to Virginia through a failed effort by the Dutch West India Company. Burdened by debt when the project collapsed, he sold himself into servitude. At 32, tall and lean with pale blue eyes, he seemed to observe everything while revealing nothing. In the evenings he carved small wooden figures with steady skill, shaping animals and faces from scraps of wood, a quiet sign of hidden talent. Punch, in his mid-20s, was lean and strong, his calm nature hiding a sharp intelligence that made him valuable to Gwyn. He understood the land instinctively, reading weather changes, knowing the right moment to harvest toba, CCO, and repairing tools with ease. He learned English quickly, absorbing it from fellow servants and the harsh commands of overseers. Though he kept mostly to himself, he earned quiet respect. Gregory once said Punch noticed things others never saw. Victor simply called him the Watcher. The Gwyn plantation, modest compared to larger estates, was its own small world. 40 acres of cleared land, a wooden and brick main house, 2 servant cabins, and a tobacco barn where leaves were cured. Behind the house, a vegetable garden carefully tended by Eleanor Gwyn, and an elderly servant woman named Bess provided food. A small apple orchard offered shade and fruit. The James River flowed wide and slow nearby, reflecting the endless Virginia sky, a reminder of the distant world beyond their isolation, connected only by the ships that traveled its waters. But beneath the routine of labor and seasons, something darker grew. A quiet, unsettling tension gnawed at John Punch each day. Hugh Gwyn's youngest son, a boy of about 12 named Thomas, had recently returned from England. The boy looked English, light brown hair and a narrow, noble face. Yet his eyes, his mouth, the shape of his hands were unmistakable. They belonged to someone else. Punch had a brother named Kofi. They were taken from the same West African village, torn apart by traders, separated on the coast, sold to different ships. Kofi arrived in Virginia 2 years before Punch. After his own arrival, Punch spent months searching, asking every African servant if they had seen a man with his brother's face, voice, and movements. He found him in the spring of 1636. Kofi was working on a nearby plantation owned by William Evans, a powerful and wealthy planter, a member of the Colonial Assembly, a man whose influence stretched across more than 200 acres of land. The land was rich prime tobacco land. The reunion between the brothers had been painfully short, a stolen single hour on a rare Sunday afternoon, when both plantations allowed their servants a precious day of rest. The 2 brothers sat beneath the wide branches of an ancient oak tree that marked the boundary between the 2 estates, and they spoke in their native tongue. Words poured out in a rush of emotion, memory, and shared grief. Kofi had changed. His hands, once smooth and powerful, were now scarred and hardened from endless field labor. His face was thin and drawn, marked by a tiredness that went far beyond simple exhaustion. And his eyes, those deep dark eyes Punch knew so well, carried a heavy sorrow that words could not explain. He told Punch about the Evans plantation, about the never-ending work, the always-present overseer, and the large main house where William Evans lived with his wife Margaret. Margaret, Kofi said, was a woman of striking beauty, but also, people whispered, a woman deeply lonely. Kofi did not say much about Margaret Evans, yet his voice shifted slightly when he spoke her name, and a brief shadow crossed his face. That small change stirred a deep and troubling unease inside Punch. Punch saw his brother only 2 more times after that first meeting. The second was in the autumn of 1636. It was another short secret meeting at the boundary line. Kofi seemed quieter, more burdened, speaking very little. The third and final meeting was in the spring of 1637. Kofi's hands were more scarred, his face more hollow, but his eyes were the same, dark, deep, and filled with a sorrow that could not be spoken. He told Punch that he was afraid something was happening on the Evans plantation, something he could not fully understand, something that felt dangerous and wrong. Then, just as suddenly as he had come back into Punch's life, he was gone. 3 months later, Kofi was dead. The official cause, W.R. Written in the colonial register, was fever, a common sickness in the Virginia summer when heat and mosquitoes spread illness that could kill a man in days. But Punch heard whispers, broken pieces of quiet talk among the servants, rumors that spread like sickness itself. Kofi had been seen near the main house late at night in the weeks before his death. Margaret Evans, people said, had been heard crying without comfort in the days before Kofi died. Then, just like that, Kofi was gone, buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the Evans plantation. His life reduced to one cold line in the records: African servant, deceased. When Thomas Gwynn returned from England in 1638, Punch saw his brother's face in the boy's features with a shock that went straight through his body. It was impossible, something that broke all logic and every rule of society. And yet it was clearly, frighteningly true. The shape of the eyes, the gentle curve of the mouth, the long, elegant fingers, they were Kofi's. Punch said nothing at first. He watched, he waited, and the more he watched, the more a terrible certainty formed inside him. Thomas Gwynn was a quiet boy, unusually quiet for his age. He was serious and studious, with a deep love for books that set him apart from other children in the colony, who cared more for riding horses and hunting. He had spent 5 important years in England, living with his mother's relatives in a small, peaceful village in Kent. He returned to Virginia not only with a trunk full of leather-bound books, but with a mind filled with ideas of a wider world, far removed from the harsh wilderness of the colony. He was always polite to the servants, never cruel, and he had a strange habit of watching them work with a thoughtful, curious look that deeply unsettled Punch. The boy's eyes were dark, darker than his father's and even darker than his mother's. His hands were low and graceful, with fingers that seemed too delicate for the hard labor of plantation life. And his mouth, when he smiled, which was rare and brief, curved in a way Punch had seen only once before, on his brother's face. Driven by an instinct he could not silence, Punch began asking careful questions. He spoke with other servants, especially those who had lived in Virginia longer, those who knew the colony's web of gossip and secrets, whispers that moved through isolated plantations like an unseen wind. He learned that Margaret Evans had given birth to a son in 1626, a boy sent to England almost immediately to be raised by distant family. He learned that William Evans, the powerful planter, had been away from his estate for several months before the boy was born, traveling to England on what was called important business. He also learned, with growing dread, that Margaret Evans had been seen often with Kofi in the months before the boy was conceived. Then came the final, crushing truth. Kofi had died just 3 months after Thomas Gwynn, the boy with Kofi's eyes, returned to Virginia. The pieces were all there, scattered and incomplete, yet Punch could see the terrible shape they formed. The truth, raw and unhidden, was impossible, dangerous and unthinkable in the rigid social order of colonial Virginia. It was late September 1638, and the tobacco harvest had reached its peak. The air was thick with heat and dampness, hanging heavy and still over the land. The fields stretched endlessly under a pale-washed blue sky, alive with the constant buzz of insects, a relentless summer sound. The sun burned down with cruel strength, baking the ground and scorching the skin, making the hard work nearly unbearable. Punch, Gregory and Victor worked side by side. their movements shaped by years of shared labor, cutting the wide, sticky tobacco leaves and hanging them carefully in. The large barn to cure. The leaves were heavy, coated in thick sap that stained their hands brown and soaked their rough clothes with sweat. The air was filled with the sweet, earthy smell of drying tobacco, clinging to skin and hair. The overseer, Robert Sweet, watched them from the small shade of a twisted oak at the field's edge. Sweet was a man shaped by colonial hardship, thin and tough, his face like worn leather, his eyes always narrowed against the sun. His voice, when he used it, was sharp and cutting, able to slice through the noise of the fields. In his late 30s, he had once been an indentured servant himself, a man who rose to authority through ruthless efficiency and firm loyalty to Hugh Gwyn. He carried a stout stick, not for beating, as Gwyn did not allow open cruelty, but for pointing, for emphasis, for showing control. He wore a wide-brimmed hat stained with sweat, and his eyes never stopped moving, always watching, always judging. Sweet had built a fearsome reputation across the colony. He was known for pulling more labor from servants than any other overseer, for sensing trouble before it fully appeared. People whispered that he kept secrets, knowing private details about planters and their families that could ruin lives if spoken aloud. Sweet was not a man to challenge, and everyone on the Gwyn plantation understood this without being told. Punch had been silent all morning, his thoughts raging beneath a calm surface. The question burned inside him, dangerous and impossible, smoldering for months. It was the kind of question that could earn a man a savage beating or worse. But he could not hold it back any longer. Seeing Thomas Gwyn earlier that day walking through the fields, dark eyes watching the servants, long fingers turning pages of a book, had pushed Punch past his limit. He saw Kofi in every line of the boy's face, in every small movement. And the weight of the secret became unbearable. As Sweet walked past him, his long shadows stretched by the late afternoon sun, Punch straightened his sore back, wiped sweat from his brow and spoke. His voice was low but steady, filled with quiet desperation. "Mr. Sweet," he said, his words cutting through the insect noise, "I need to ask you something." Sweet stopped at once and turned slowly, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Gregory and Victor froze, as did two others nearby, a young Englishman named Peter and an older African named Samuel. The air felt heavier, the buzzing louder in the sudden stillness. "What is it, Punch?" Sweet asked, his voice flat and calm, a dangerous calm. Punch paused for a heartbeat, then with courage born of despair, he spoke the words that would destroy everything. "The boy, young Master Thomas, why does he look exactly like my brother?" The words hung in the thick air like poison smoke. Gregory's eyes widened in fear and disbelief, and he stepped back without thinking. Victor tightened his grip on the sharp tobacco knife until his knuckles turned white. Peter and Samuel traded quick, frightened looks, their faces growing pale. Sweet's face, pale with shock at first, quickly flushed into a deep, angry red. He took a threatening step toward Punch. His thick stick, usually used to point and command, lifted slightly, becoming a quiet warning. "What did you say?" Sweet's voice was almost a whisper, but it carried a cold and frightening weight. Punch felt his body shake, but he did not step back. He held Sweet's eyes without wavering. "My brother Kofi worked for Mr. Evans. He died last year. That boy has his face, his hands, his eyes. I need to know why." Sweet's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping hard in his cheek. He glanced quickly around the field, checking to see who else might have heard those dangerous words. The other servants acted as if they had gone back to work, but they were clearly listening, their faces tight with fear and dark curiosity. Sweet leaned close to Punch, his voice a sharp hiss, barely louder than the buzzing insects. "You don't ask questions like that, Punch. You don't even think them. Do you hear me?" "I just want to know," Punch began, his voice cracking a little. "You want to know?" Sweet suddenly raised his voice, shattering the thin calm. The servants jumped at the sound, shrinking back. "You want to know why a white boy looks like your dead brother? You think you're allowed to ask that?" His eyes, usually cold and controlled, now burned with a dangerous rage. Punch said nothing. He stared back at Sweet, silent but unbroken. Sweet's hand shook as it gripped the stick. He turned sharply and marched toward the main house, his steps fast and angry, leaving heavy tension behind him. Gregory, his face full of fear, grabbed Punch's arm with surprising strength. "What have you done?" he whispered urgently. "You've signed your own death paper." Punch pulled his arm free, still shaking. "I had to know," he muttered, his voice empty. Victor, always practical, slowly shook his head, his pale blue eyes filled with grim truth. "Knowing will kill you, Punch." Peter, the young Englishman, his face grey, spoke softly. "He's right. Sweet will tell Gwyn, and Gwyn will—" He stopped, unable to finish the thought. Samuel, the older African man, laid a heavy but gentle hand on Punch's shoulder. "You should run," he said quietly, "tonight, before they come for you." But Punch, filled with both defiance and despair, did not run. He went back to his work, cutting tobacco leaves and hanging them in the barn, his movements empty and automatic. His mind spun wildly. He had asked the question, and there was no way to take it back. Whatever came next, he had spoken the truth, and truth always demanded a price. What Punch could not know, in his desperate need for answers, was that his single bold question had lit a slow-burning fire that would one day change the laws of an entire continent. Because Robert, the overseer, did not go straight to Hugh Gwyn that afternoon. He went to someone else, someone far more powerful and far more dangerous. That night, under the cold light of a nearly full moon, Robert rode hard toward the plantation of William Evans, the man who had once owned Kofi. The 2-hour ride along the rough dirt road connecting the lonely plantations near the winding James River passed in a blur of pounding hooves and racing thoughts. Moonlight stretched long, twisted shadows across forests and open fields, turning the land into something strange and unsettling. The cooler air carried the steady song of crickets and the distant cry of a wolf, sounds that fed Sweet's growing dread. He pushed his horse faster, his mind racing with the terrible meaning of Punch's question. William Evans was no ordinary planter. He was one of the most powerful men in the colony, rich, connected, and feared, a leading member of the colonial assembly. His influence reached deep into Virginia's highest circles. His plantation was vast and thriving, with hundreds of acres of tobacco, a grand brick house, and dozens of servants and laborers. Evans, in his mid-50s, stood tall and solid, his gray hair neatly kept, his face hard and unreadable. He was known for his sharp mind, strong ambition, and cruel practicality. He was also known for his violent temper and for destroying anyone who threatened his name or wealth. Sweet and Evans spoke behind the closed doors of Evans's rich study for 2 long, painful hours. The room, usually quiet and calm, became filled with harsh whispers and rising anger. Servants later said they heard shouting, furniture scraping, and at one moment, the sound of glass breaking. When Sweet finally came out, his face was ghostly pale and his hands shook badly. He mounted his horse without a word and rode back to the Gwyn plantation, his eyes hollow with fear. Early the next morning, as the sun began to rise, Hugh Gwyn received a visit that filled the air with dread. William Evans arrived with 2 other powerful planters, Thomas Warren and Richard Bennett. They spoke with Gwyn on the porch for more than an hour, their voices low and tense. Eleanor Gwyn watched from an upstairs window, her heart heavy with fear. Thomas Gwyn, the boy whose face had started everything, was kept hidden away. When the meeting ended, Gwyn's face looked broken and grey. He called Sweet over at once, and the two spoke quietly. Then Gwyn ordered Punch, Gregory, and Victor to come forward. They stood in the dusty yard under the burning sun, as Gwyn spoke coldly. "You are leaving. You are being sent to a plantation in Maryland until your contracts end." Gregory stepped forward, confused and angry. "Maryland is weeks away, Master Gwyn. Why?" "Because I say so," Gwyn snapped. "You leave tomorrow?" Victor asked calmly about their contracts. Gwyn dismissed him, saying they could be transferred and that they would work for a man named John Dandy. The name fell like a curse. Punch felt a deep, icy fear. This was no simple move. It was exile, and he knew it was because of his question. That night, the 3 men sat together in their dark cabin. Gregory paced in rage and fear. Victor carved wood silently. Punch sat on the dirt floor, his back to the wall, his mind searching for hope. "We can't go to Maryland," Gregory said desperately. "We'll never return. They're sending us away to silence us, to bury what Punch knows." "They're sending Punch away," Victor corrected, his voice low and hard. "We are just collateral, Gregory. Unlucky witnesses." Gregory stopped his frantic pacing and turned toward Punch, his eyes wide, filled with a desperate need to understand. "What did you see, Punch? What made you ask that question? What could be so terrible that they would send all of us away?" Punch, his voice barely more than a whisper, shared the impossible truth. He told them about Kofi, his beloved brother, and the clear, haunting likeness between Kofi and young Thomas Gwyn. He spoke of the whispers he had carefully collected, bits of gossip that slowly joined together into a terrifying story. He told them about Margaret Evans, the beautiful and lonely wife of the powerful planter, and the quiet rumors of her forbidden bond with Kofi. He spoke of Kofi's sudden and suspicious death, officially blamed on fever, but quietly believed to be something far darker. Then, with chilling clarity, he revealed the truth he had slowly pieced together, that Thomas Gwyn was not Hugh Gwyn's son, but Kofi's, a child born from a forbidden union, a secret that threatened to tear apart the very foundations of colonial society. Gregory stared at him, his mouth hanging open, his face frozen between disbelief and rising horror. Victor, his carving knife forgotten in his hand, looked up, his pale blue eyes wide with shock. "Jesus Christ," Gregory whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop himself. "You're saying the boy is half African, that he's Kofi's son?" "I'm saying the boy is my brother's son," Punch said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of truth. Victor slowly shook his head, his gaze distant and troubled. "If that's true, Punch, and if anyone ever finds out, it would destroy the Gwyn family, the Evans family, and probably half the powerful planters in Virginia. It would be a scandal that would shake the colony to its core. That's why they're sending us away," Gregory said, his voice filled with grim certainty. "They want to bury this secret, and they plan to bury us with it, far away in Maryland where no one will ever hear us." Punch looked at both men, his eyes burning with desperate resolve. "We have to run," he said firmly. "Tonight, before they can take us." Gregory, after a moment of stunned silence, nodded sharply. "Tonight." Victor stared at the flickering candle flame for a long moment, then finally nodded as well. "Tonight," he echoed, his voice low and determined. They disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, carrying nothing but the worn clothes on their backs and a small, thin sack of cornmeal, their only food against the vast, unforgiving wilderness. They headed north, clinging to the distant hope of Maryland, a land they believed might offer freedom, a chance to vanish among the growing numbers of free laborers. Their plan was simple and born of fear: reach Maryland, find work, and fade into anonymity. But they were not alone in the silent wilderness. Robert, the ever-watchful overseer, had expected their desperate escape. He had sent word ahead, his warnings carried by fast riders, and by the time Punch, Gregory, and Victor, exhausted and terrified, reached the poorly marked border between Virginia and Maryland, a group of armed planters was already waiting. Their capture was swift, violent, and without mercy. The three men, their bodies aching from days of hard travel, were suddenly surrounded. 6 armed planters on strong horses emerged from the thick brush, their muskets catching the pale morning light, their faces hard and unyielding. There was no chance to flee and no hope of fighting back. The odds were overwhelming. Their dream of freedom died in an instant. Punch, Gregory, and Victor were roughly tied with thick ropes, their hands pulled painfully behind their backs, their hope crushed. They were forced to march back to Virginia on foot, a humiliating and agonizing journey that lasted 3 brutal days. They were given little food and even less water. Their throats dry, their bodies pushed close to collapse. By the time they reached Jamestown, the colonial capital, they were utterly broken, their skin burned and blistered by the sun, their clothes filthy and torn, their spirits shattered, and their hearts filled with deep, chilling fear. The colonial court gathered on July 9, 1640, a date that would be carved into the dark history of America. The courtroom was a small, cramped wooden building near the dusty center of Jamestown. It was hot and airless, the heavy humidity clinging to everything, and the narrow, dirty windows allowed only thin strips of weak light inside. The room was packed tight with stern-faced planters, curious servants, and onlookers eager to witness what they called justice, or perhaps something far more sinister. Punch, Gregory, and Victor stood at the center of the room, their hands still bound, their bodies swaying with exhaustion. The judge, Sir Francis Wyatt, the governor of Virginia, presided over the court. He was a stern and imposing man, his graying hair neatly combed, his face hard as stone, showing no hint of emotion. His presence alone carried chilling authority. Hugh Gwyn, Punch's master, testified first. He stood tall before the court, his posture stiff, his voice calm and controlled, skilled in careful deception. He described the 3 men as disobedient, ungrateful, and completely untrustworthy. He spoke of their escape, painting them as rebellious and defiant, and demanded that their terms of service be extended as proper punishment. The court listened in heavy silence, broken only by the steady scratching of the clerk's quill as each word was written down. Then Robert, the overseer, stepped forward. He walked slowly, his face carefully blank, and placed his hand on the worn B. Bull. His oath felt cold and formal. His testimony, delivered with false calm, was precise and devastating. The African John Punch, Sweet began, his voice steady and clear, asked me a question about my master's son, a question that suggested impropriety. The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. A wave of murmurs moved through the courtroom. Governor Wyatt leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "What kind of question?" he demanded. Sweet paused, as if reluctant to speak, then sighed and said, "He asked why the boy looked like his brother, a dead African who worked for Mr. Evans." A sharp gasp spread through the room. Wyatt's face darkened as he turned his cold gaze on Punch. "Is this true?" he asked. Punch met his stare, fear gripping him, but his voice remained steady. "Yes, sir. I asked because I wanted the truth." "The truth?" Wyatt repeated with clear contempt. He glanced briefly at William Evans in the front row, then looked back at Punch. "The truth is not yours to seek." The room erupted with whispers until Wyatt slammed his gavel for silence. He then sentenced Gregory and Victor to extra years of service and lashes. Finally, he turned back to Punch, the room falling silent as he began to speak, his voice slow, cold, and final. "The social order of this colony is a fragile balance that we are sworn to protect and preserve. For these serious crimes, for this unforgivable violation of the established order, you are hereby sentenced to serve your master, Hugh Gwyn, for the rest of your natural life." The courtroom exploded in reaction. A sharp collective gasp was followed by a low wave of stunned murmurs that rolled through the crowd. Punch stared at Wyatt, his thoughts spinning wildly, completely unable to grasp the terrible words he had just heard. Life service, not 4 years like Gregory and Victor, not 10 years or even 20, but life, his end. Our existence from this moment on was permanently bound, with no hope of freedom. Gregory and Victor were dragged away roughly, their faces drained of color, frozen in shock and despair, their fate sealed beyond appeal. Punch remained standing alone in the center of the courtroom, his hands still tied, his mind a violent storm of disbelief and crushing hopelessness. He had asked a question, a simple and desperate question, and the answer, spoken with cold legal precision, had taken everything from him. His freedom, his future, his very humanity were stripped away in a single chilling judgment. But the story, dark as it was, did not end there. What happened in that suffocating Jamestown courtroom, the terrible sentence given to John Punch, was not just punishment for a supposed crime. It was a precedent, a legal foundation built on the suffering of one man that would permanently change the path of a growing nation. And the question he dared to ask, a question so simple yet so dangerous, one that troubled the overseer's conscience and exposed a buried truth, would echo through time, a quiet, haunting reminder of the deep and destructive power of injustice. Punch was sent back to Hugh Gwyn's plantation, but he was no longer the same man. The brutal whipping he endured, 30 lashes delivered with cold efficiency, the same number given to Gregory and Victor, left his back raw and burning. The wounds healed into thick scars that would never fully fade, constant reminders of his punishment. Yet the deepest wounds could not be seen. They were carved into his mind and soul by the crushing knowledge that he would never again be free, that his life from this moment forward belonged entirely to another man's will. The hope that had carried him through the terror of the ocean crossing and the endless labor in the tobacco fields was gone, replaced by a deep, frozen despair. The Thur servants, once united with him in shared suffering, now kept their distance. Their eyes avoided him, their voices dropped to whispers. They feared him, not because of anything he had done, but because of what his fate represented. In Punch's endless bondage, they saw a terrifying reflection of what could one day become their own future. A future where skin color, not a written contract, decided a person's fate. Gregory and Victor, after surviving their own whippings, were quickly sent to work in a distant, isolated part of the plantation, separated on purpose. Punch rarely saw them again, and their friendship faded into a painful memory. Hugh Gwyn treated Punch with cold and measured indifference, speaking only to give short commands. his eyes carefully avoiding Punch's face, as if refusing to acknowledge the humanity of the man he now owned for life. Robert, the overseer, watched him with sharp, almost hunting eyes, always alert, as if expecting Punch to run again, waiting for any small mistake that could justify more punishment. But Punch did not run. Broken by despair, he worked, he obeyed, and he watched. He watched the seasons change, the tobacco plants grow and die, the river flow endlessly toward the sea. And he watched Thomas Gwynn. Thomas grew older, changing from a quiet child into a young man. By 1645 he was 19, tall and strong, his body filled out, his movements confident and sure. He had his mother's pale, refined skin and his father's firm, determined jaw. He had completed his education in England and returned to Virginia with a polished accent and the manners of the English elite. He was being carefully prepared to inherit his father's expanding plantation, to marry well, and to produce heirs who would carry the Gwynn name forward in the New World. But his eyes, dark and deep with a strange intensity, his long, elegant hands, the subtle smoothen. In the way he moved, all of it was unmistakably Kofi's. Punch saw it every day, in quick glances, in unconscious gestures, and with each passing day the burning question gnawed at him more fiercely. Why did this young man, heir to a powerful English family, bear the clear features of his dead African brother? And why had that question cost Punch his freedom, his entire life? The answer came slowly, piece by piece, gathered over years of silent watching and quiet listening. It came from older servants who had once worked at the Evans plantation, those who remembered the past with sharp clarity shaped by fear. It came from fragments of conversations overheard between planters, their voices low and cautious. Slowly, like a twisted mosaic, the truth began to take shape, each piece more horrifying than the last. Margaret Evans, the beautiful and isolated wife of the powerful William Evans, had lived in deep loneliness. Her husband, driven by ambition and power, was rarely home. He traveled often to England, attended endless meetings in Jamestown, and visited other plantations to secure deals and alliances. Margaret remained alone in the grand house, its wide rooms filled with silence, surrounded only by servants who dared not speak freely. Kofi, Punch's brother, worked in the main house. He was intelligent, well-spoken, and carried a quiet dignity that set him apart. He tended the gardens, repaired fine furniture, and handled the many small tasks that kept the household running. Margaret noticed him. What began as distant, careful interaction slowly became something intimate and dangerous. Their relationship, formed from isolation and human need, was brief, secret, and filled with risk, breaking every rule of the colony. When Margaret realized she was pregnant, terror overtook her. She claimed the child was her husband's, conceived during one of his rare visits, but he knew the timing did not match. Desperate to protect her reputation and avoid ruin, she made a harsh decision. The child would be sent to England to be raised by distant relatives, far from Virginia, and the truth of his birth. The secret had to remain buried at all costs, but Kofi knew. And when he finally understood that his son had been taken from him and sent across the ocean, he confronted Margaret. That choice sealed his fate. Terrified that her secret would be exposed, Margaret confessed everything to her husband. William Evans, powerful and ruthless, made sure Kofi would never speak again. Kofi's death, officially blamed on fever, was no accident. It was murder hidden behind lies. His body was buried quickly in an unmarked grave. Servants whispered about bruises on his neck, about his wide, frozen eyes filled with fear, but no one dared speak openly. Fear kept them silent, and when John Punch dared to ask his question, threatening to expose the lie, the powerful planters moved quickly. Gwynn, Evans, Sweet, and their allies twisted the law to silence him forever. In doing so, they created something far darker, a new form of bondage, not bound by contract, but by race. Just when it seemed this horror could go no deeper, the truth revealed even darker layers of cruelty and injustice. If this story chills you, if this forgotten history weighs on you, then share it with someone else who needs to know, appreciates the darkest secrets of the past. Hit the like button to support our channel and help us uncover more of these hidden truths. And most importantly, don't forget to subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss another story like this. Let's keep walking this path together as we reach the haunting climax of John Punch's tragic search for truth. The year is 1650. 10 long years had passed since that terrible day in the Jamestown courtroom. 10 hard, exhausting years since John Punch was sentenced to a life with no end, a life without freedom. He was now 40 years old. His body, once strong and lean, was now worn down and bent by endless soul-crushing labor in the tobacco fields. His spirit, though not broken, had been hardened by the constant weight of injustice and the grinding despair of never-ending servitude. His hands, once quick and skilled, were now twisted and scarred, the skin thick and rough from years of gripping tools and cutting tobacco leaves. His back, once straight and proud, was now forever curved, shaped by countless hours bent over the crops. His face, once smooth and young, was now deeply lined, marked by sun, wind, and a suffering too deep for words. Yet through all the pain, through both physical agony and emotional torment, he had not forgotten. The truth, the dangerous and almost impossible truth, still burned inside him like a glowing ember, a quiet but defiant flame. One evening, as the sun, a burning ball of fire, slowly sank below the western horizon, throwing long, twisted shadows across the wide tobacco fields, Punch was approached by a young servant. The boy was barely 16 years old. His name was Samuel. He had arrived at the plantation just 2 years earlier, a fresh-faced English orphan who, like many others, had sold himself into servitude to escape the crushing poverty and hopeless future of London's harsh streets. Samuel was curious, unusually so for someone his age, with a sharp mind that shone in his bright, questioning eyes. He carried a rare and almost reckless courage, never afraid to ask questions or challenge what everyone else silently accepted. These traits, in a painful reminder of his own youth, made Punch see himself as he once was, many years before. "Mr. Punch," Samuel began, his voice barely above a whisper, shaking with a mix of fear and awe. "Is it true? Did you really ask why the master's son looked like your brother?" Punch kept his eyes on the far horizon, where the sun was now just a thin strip of orange. Slowly he turned to face the boy. He studied Samuel for a long, silent moment, his eyes old and heavy with memory, searching the boy's honest face. Then, with a slow and careful nod, he confirmed the unthinkable. "I did." Samuel's young face filled with shock. "And they made you a slave for life because of it? Just for asking a question?" "Yes," Punch said quietly, his voice flat and empty, shaped by years of buried pain. Samuel's wide, innocent eyes filled with tears that did not fall, reflecting the burning colors of the sunset. "That's not right," he whispered. "That's not justice, Mr. Punch." Punch moved slowly and reached out, placing his rough, calloused hand on the boy's thin shoulder. The weight of his hand, heavy with years of work and sorrow, carried more meaning than words ever could. "No," he said softly, his voice dry with age and weariness. "It's not, but it's the world we live in now, Samuel, the world they have built." Samuel looked up at him, his face pale in the fading light, his young eyes full of a desperate, unspoken hope. "Will it always be this way, Mr. Punch? Will it always be like this for us?" Punch did not reply. He could not. He did not know. But he knew one thing with cold certainty. The question he had asked, the dangerous question that had cost him everything, would not die with him. It would be asked again and again by those who came after him, by people who would suffer under the very system his punishment helped create. And one day, maybe far in the future, someone would finally find the answer. Someone would finally speak the truth that had been buried for so long. That night, as the last traces of twilight disappeared and the wide, star-filled sky spread above the colony, Punch lay on his rough straw pallet inside the small, silent cabin. He stared into the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the plantation settling into uneasy rest, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the soft night wind, the quiet creak of the cabin walls. His mind, however, was restless and storm-filled. He thought of Kofi, his beloved brother, a bright and intelligent man torn away from him. A brother he had lost twice, first to the slave traders and then to the planters' dark and deadly scheme. He thought of the son Kofi never knew, the boy who carried his brother's face, the boy who walked freely among them, living proof of a forbidden love and a brutal killing. He thought of Thomas Gwynn, the young man who unknowingly carried the physical mark of a truth too dangerous to speak, a truth that would always be hidden from him. And again, Punch returned to the question, the simple but deadly question that shattered his world, changed his life forever, and, in a cruel twist of fate, helped lay the groundwork for slavery in English America. Why does young master look exactly like my brother? The answer, he knew, was buried under layers of secrets and lies, carefully built by men driven by fear, pride, and a desperate need to protect their mess and their fragile social order. The answer was not written in ink, but in the laws of Virginia, in the cold words of court records that sentenced Punch to a lifetime in chains. It lived in the dark precedent that would be used again and again to justify the enslavement of millions, stripping them of their humanity and reducing them to property. In its rawest form, the answer flowed through Thomas Gwynne's veins. The undeniable blood of an African man and an English woman, joined in a union the colony, bound by rigid racial rules, could never admit, accept, or forgive. And perhaps most of all, the answer lived in silence. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed whenever Punch's name was spoken. The silence that surrounded the events of 1640. The silence over Kofi's unmarked grave, a quiet witness to a life violently erased. A silence meant to last for centuries, covering one of the darkest foundations of American history. John Punch died in 1655, still a servant, still bound to Hugh Gwynne's plantation. His life ended exactly as the law had defined it 15 years earlier, in permanent servitude. His death, like his life, was recorded with cold simplicity in the colonial register, a single short line filled with what it did not say: John Punch, African, deceased. There was no age listed, no cause of death, no recognition of his life, his brave question, or the tragic fate that followed. In official records, he became nothing more than a statistic. He was buried, as others of his status were, in an unmarked grave at the edge of the plantation, in a lonely patch of ground where servants, both European and African, were laid to rest. There was no service, no speech, no marker of any kind. No stone, no cross, nothing to show where he lay. Within a year, thick Virginia grass grew over the soil, wiping away any visible sign of his resting place. It was as if John N.C.H., the man who dared to ask, had never existed at all. But his legacy did not disappear. The legal precedent created by his case, life servitude for an African while Europeans received only longer contracts for the same offense, became the cruel foundation of slavery in English America. Within one generation, the Virginia Assembly, guided by the framework shaped by Punch's sentence, began passing harsher laws. These laws slowly locked slavery to race, making it permanent, inherited, and tied forever to African descent. By 1700, less than 60 years after Punch's trial, slavery had become the driving force of the colonial economy, a brutal system that would last for more than 200 years and shape the identity of a growing nation. The question John Punch asked was answered with chains, with whips, with the organized destruction of human dignity, and with centuries of unbearable suffering. Thomas Gwynne, the young man whose strong resemblance to Kofi had started this tragic chain of events, grew older, inherited his father's successful plantation, and lived a long and comfortable life. He married well, choosing the daughter of another wealthy planter, strengthening his family's place in colonial society. He had children of his own, heirs who proudly carried the Gwynne name, never knowing the painful truth about their bloodline, about the African man whose blood flowed silently through their veins. Thomas became a respected member of the Colonial Assembly, a man of power and influence, praised as a pillar of Virginia society. He never knew the truth about his beginnings, or if he ever did, whether some faint and disturbing whisper of it ever reached his ears. He never spoke about it. The secret, like a poisonous snake, died with him, buried just as deeply and just as permanently as John Punch's unmarked grave. Robert, the overseer whose testimony had sealed Punch's destiny, vanished from the colonial records sometime around 1652. What ultimately happened to him remains wrapped in uncertainty. Some people whispered that he drank himself into an early death, tormented by the dangerous question Punch had dared to ask, and by the cold awareness of what he himself had done, of the role he played in shaping a new and cruel form of bondage. Others believed he simply left Virginia, unable to live under the crushing weight of his own conscience, unable to face the truth of the man he had helped condemn. His disappearance, like so many troubling truths of that era, was quietly swallowed by the vast and silent rhythm of colonial life. Hugh Gwynn, the man who owned Punch, continued to thrive. His plantation expanded, his fortune grew rapidly, and he became, by all reports, one of the most successful and well-regarded planters in Virginia. He never spoke of John Punch, ever mentioned the infamous trial, never admitted the central and chilling role he had played in establishing a legal example that would go on to shape American slavery. When he died in 1663, he was laid to rest with full honors in the Jamestown churchyard, his grave marked by a grand stone praising his contributions to the growing colony. Elenina Gwynn, Hugh's wife, lived until 1670. She spent her final years mostly confined to the large main house, seldom stepping outside, her health slowly fading, perhaps weighed down by the heavy and unspoken secrets she carried. She never spoke of Margaret Evans, never mentioned Kofi, never acknowledged the painful truth that as a woman living in that household, she must have known, or at least strongly suspected. When she finally died, she was buried beside her husband, and those secrets, like ancient dust, faded away with her. William Evans, the influential planter who had once owned Kofi, continued serving in the Colonial Assembly until his death in 1659. He remained a powerful and commanding figure, a man who actively shaped Virginia's laws and policies, a man whose voice carried great authority. He never spoke of Kofi, never referred to the African servant who had worked in his home, never admitted the forbidden relationship between his wife and the man he had killed. His reputation stayed carefully protected, his legacy as a respected and powerful planter completely secure, and the question itself, why does young master look exactly like my brother, was buried deep within colonial archives, reduced to a forgotten whisper in dusty court documents, lost to shared memory for generations. It stayed there as a quiet and unsettling reminder of a truth too dangerous to speak aloud, until careful historians studying faded records slowly uncovered the court files and patiently pieced together the tragic story of the man who dared to ask it. In 1640, the Virginia court, with chilling certainty, sentenced John Punch to lifelong servitude, creating the first legal foundation for race-based slavery in English America. Within 20 years, the Virginia Assembly, building on this dark groundwork, passed laws that firmly locked slavery into place, making it permanent and inherited for all people of African descent. By the start of the 18th century, slavery had become the unquestioned backbone of the colonial economy, a cruel system of exploitation and control that would last for more than 2 centuries, leaving a deep and lasting wound on the soul of a nation. The question John Punch asked in his desperate search for truth was never answered during his life, yet it echoed silently through time. It was asked again and again by millions who were enslaved, stripped of freedom, treated as property instead of human beings. It was asked by brave abolitionists who fought tirelessly to destroy the brutal institution of slavery, by soldiers who gave their lives in the bloody struggle of the Civil War, by civil rights activists who marched and suffered for equality, and in many ways it is still being asked today. It is asked by historians who uncover forgotten lives like that of John Punch, by descendants searching courageously for the truth about their roots, by a nation still struggling with the painful and complex legacy of slavery and the enduring question of what freedom truly means. John Punch's story is not just a historical detail. It is a powerful and haunting reminder that history is not only shaped by the famous and the powerful, but by ordinary people whose lives were forever changed, by the choices of others, whose voices were silenced, whose stories were intentionally buried. It is a stark reminder that the past never truly disappears, that the questions we face today are, at their core, same questions asked centuries ago, and that the pursuit of truth and justice is a journey humanity has never fully completed. This unsettling mystery drawn from the dusty records of colonial Virginia shows how a single bold question, simple in its wording, can permanently change the course of history. It reveals that the search for truth can demand an unbearable price, and that the legacy of injustice can survive for centuries. What do you think about this story? Do you believe justice was ever truly done for John Punch? Do you think the painful truth about Thomas Gwynn's origins should have been revealed no matter the consequences? Share your thoughts, your feelings, and your insights in the comments below. If this powerful story has held your attention, if the shadows of this dark history have captured your imagination, then subscribe to our channel, press the notification bell, and share this video with someone who, like you, is drawn to the deepest and most unsettling mysteries of history. We will see you in the next video as we continue to uncover the forgotten stories that shape our world.